Hello, everybody. Happy Tax Day. I am thrilled to be here with T.R. Reid, the man who will travel the world and find us answers on so many things, healthcare and now taxes. And this is the journal book product of your adventuring. Is that correct?
That's right. That's a book about how other countries manage to collect tax more fairly and much more simply than the U.S. does.
So I am enthralled by this book, and I'm enthralled by your whole model of policy comparison. Like we need, I was, I've been thinking about this. We need you to do this for every single issue. The climate.
Yeah.
We've got healthcare and taxes, but let's keep it going. So to those who don't know, you're a journalist, and you went around the world and are like, okay, the average American spends 30 hours on their taxes. How are other countries doing it, and can they do it better? Is that a fair summation?
Yeah, that's right. So what happened was, I was a newspaper reporter and a reporter for NPR, and I don't like bosses. I don't get along with authority very well. So I wanted to put a little distance between me and my editor. So I moved 10,000 miles away. I moved to Tokyo to be a foreign correspondent, and then I was a foreign correspondent in many other countries. Just my rule for work is never work within 8 time zones of the boss. That really works out pretty well. They don't bother you then, You just do your job and they leave you alone. And there are a lot of different ways to be a foreign correspondent. Some guys are crazy about wars. They go anywhere they can go to find a war or a conflict. Some people are kind of into these quaint foreigner stories, like, gee, they eat seaweed for breakfast kind of thing. But I didn't want to do that stuff. So I decided what I'd do as a foreign correspondent is try to figure out what it is that other countries do that we don't want to do, that we should avoid, and what other countries do that's better that we're doing in the United States. And as you said, one of the issues I took on was crime. The United States has very high rates of crime compared to other rich countries, and most of them control crime with far fewer police and fewer jails and judges than we have. So I wrote a book about that. It's called Confucius Lives Next Door. And then I did a book on how other rich countries manage to provide health care for everybody with much better health outcomes than the United States has for half our cost. Other countries have much better health care and spend half of what we do. I did that book. And that healthcare book was a big bestseller. It was on the New York Times list for a long time. It's unusual for me. Most of my books have flopped in the market, but that one really sold. And so
Don't
then
sell
my
yourself
editor
short.
said,
They're excellent. Sorry,
"Yeah,
continue.
no, people should buy them. Hey, they make great Mother's Day giving. If you're worried about what to give your mom, my tax book is a great gift." And then my editor said, let's do it again. So then we did tax policy, and I went around the world to see how other rich countries, countries like us, advanced high-tech free market democracies, that's Western Europe, Tokyo, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, how do they collect taxes? And it turns out in all those countries, they have made the tax code vastly simpler than ours. And they have better ways to collect taxes. There's less cheating, there's less confusion. Interestingly, most of the rich countries collect more taxes than we do. If Americans complain that we're overtaxed, Donald Trump said we have the highest taxes in the world, but that was just not true. As a matter of fact, in terms of the tax ordinary people pay or rich people pay, the Americans pay less than people in Western Europe or Japan or Australia, for example. And then the striking thing for me, which really kind of hits home today on tax day when we're all struggling to get those forms in, is how much easier it is. So, the IRS estimates that the average American family, as you just said, spends about 30 hours gathering receipts and filling out forms and getting documents ready. Average American family spends $260 a year on tax preparation. The people with higher incomes spend thousands of dollars. Get this, you know how much it costs to file your tax return in the Netherlands? $0. You know how long it takes? 15 minutes. In Britain, it costs nothing and it takes about 2 minutes. Ditto in Japan. In Japan, about a minute and a half to file your taxes for the year. So, and guess what? We could do that too. We could make it that simple too. We just have not.
Well, and I expected to be angry reading your book because most people at this point probably have a sense that, America isn't a perfect country. Who knew? But
Yeah.
what I didn't expect is how angry I was going to get. Even things I would have never expected. Like you point out that for things like charitable giving and mortgage payment deductions that middle class people tend to like, they don't really benefit the average middle class taxpayer. They're there for incredibly wealthy people to like buy a wing of an art museum and be like, yeah, I don't want to pay taxes on that. I'm a giver.
Yeah. I mean, there's a guy in my book who, a very rich guy in Maryland who turned his barn into an art museum. It's locked up. Only he and his family can go, but all his contributions to that museum are tax deductible. So, yeah, people like the deduction for charitable contributions. They like the mortgage interest tax deduction, but as you say, the big winners from that are very rich people. Only about 20% of Americans get to take those deductions because you have to have used the itemized deduction to do it. And because it costs the government money, the government gets less tax money because of the deductions. They have to raise our rates and make us pay more taxes so that rich people can get a deduction for giving to a charity. So it's not a good idea. Most countries in the world have dropped the charitable deduction. They encourage you to give to charity. It's a good idea. Please do. But we're not going to give you a tax break for it. We think you just ought to do it because it's the right thing to do. I'd say about half the rich countries still have a deduction for mortgage interest, but most of them are getting rid of that. Those deductions, as you say, mainly help rich people, and they force the rest of us to pay higher taxes to make up for what the government loses through the deduction.
Well, and you write a lot about the tension that it's so obvious I would have never thought about it, that it's not just what the tax rates are on the book, it's about what power does the government actually have to collect those taxes? And
Yeah.
another way our the game is sort of stacked against ordinary Americans is that rich people have great lawyers. So, what the type of thing that an ordinary American is probably going to be like, you know what? Okay, it's not worth it. Sure. I'll just pay this.
Yeah.
The wealthy will spend a lot of time trying to wriggle out of it.
That's right. I mean, people routinely spend $50,000, $100,000 with a lawyer and a tax accountant to come up with a tax avoidance plan. Costs them $100,000 and they save 10 million in taxes. It's a good deal for them. It doesn't work for the rest of us. The rest of us end up filling out the forms and gathering the receipts and paying the tax. So, yeah, when you have a system as complicated as ours, it provides a benefit to people who can afford legal ways to avoid taxation. The great journalist Michael Kinsley used to say the real scandal isn't people breaking the law. The real scandal is what's legal. And in the tax code, it's kind of amazing how many thousands and thousands of deductions and giveaways are legal. They're in the tax code. For example, what do you think people would say if the president stood up in the State of the Union address and said, I got a good idea. Let's have the government send $7,500 to anybody who buys a $120,000 BMW sports car made in Germany.
I like to think they'd riot.
Yeah, I don't think people would like that. This is a boon to rich people and to foreign automakers that the U.S. government's going to pay. We would never approve that, right? Except it's there. It's in the tax code. If you buy an electric-powered BMW sports car made in Germany, you get $7,500 tax credit in the United States. And the tax code is just full of these. You get a tax credit for recycling an old tractor. You get a tax credit for planting plantain bushes. How many Americans do that? But they had lobbyists who went to Congress and said, this is a good thing. Let's have a tax credit for it. So the code is just full of this. They're called tax expenditures because it's just the same as the government sending a check out. when they give you a tax credit, but there are all sorts of things that they could never dare send somebody a check for that are in there for a tax credit.
Well, and you talk about that a lot, which I love, because you're absolutely correct. We tend to think differently of the government handing you a check for $8,000 or $7,500 than them just basically giving you that through the tax code. But it's no different. It's absolutely no different. And, I don't think I personally ever realized that most people's systems were not this intricate and complex. Like,
Yeah.
was that a surprise to you, or did you kind of know that going into this?
No, I'm an American. I thought the complicated taxes were a fact of life. Death and taxes, you can't avoid them. And then, as I say, I traveled the world. I decided I would fill out Form 1040, or the basic tax form, in every country and see how complicated it was, how long it took. And as I said, in several countries, in the Netherlands, in Britain, in Japan, a few other countries, the tax agency, the IRS, fills out the form for you. They know all the numbers. They know how much income you made. They know how much tax was withheld. They know how much mortgage interest you paid. They know how much interest you earned in the bank. Tax agencies know all that. The IRS knows that. So they fill out the form for you, and then they send it to you. And if you like it, you just check a box and you're done. If you don't like it, you have the right to fill out your own tax return and file. I was in Japan working on this book, and I said to my good friend, Togo Shigehiko, is a good friend of mine, and I said, hey, Shige, I'm going to watch you file your tax return just to see how long it takes. And he said to me, file my tax return? Not sure what you mean. What do you mean? I said, well, how do you pay your... He said, well, I get this postcard in the mail from the government. It says, we think you earned this much. You paid this much. We owe you a refund. If you think this is right, check this box. And about 99% of the time it's right. He checks the box. And get this, in America, it can take weeks, months even, to get a refund. In Japan, the tax day is March 14th. And by law, they have to make all the refund payments by April 1st. This is another good rule. So I said to Togo, when he was checking this box, taking 1 minute to file his taxes, I said, God, this is great. I said, in America, people spend days gathering receipts and filling out forms and making calculations to do their taxes. And he says to me, well, why would anybody want to do that?
That's horrifying, by the way.
I know. And you know what? And the IRS could do this for about 80% of the people who just spend hours or spend hundreds of dollars to file their taxes. About 80% of Americans, the IRS knows all the numbers already. So they could fill out your form for you, send it to you, and if you like it, you're done. If not, you can do your own. The IRS has this form called the IL-220 notice. They send out about 22 million of them every year. And this is a notice that says, we got your tax return, and on line 38, you entered $4,120, and it should have been $4,893. You made a mistake. And when I've gotten this notice, and when I get it, I say, well, if they already knew that, why did I have to dig through all these documents to find the number? And then I got it wrong. So the IRS could do this for everybody. And every year, there are about 20 members of Congress, Republican and Democrat, who introduce a law every year to say, let's have the IRS as an option, fill out your tax return for you. And guess what? H&R Block and Intuit, the tax preparation companies, lobby against it. And they've always killed it. Yeah. So guess what? We pay more and they make more profit. That's the way our system works.
Well, and I feel foolish because until I read your book, I didn't really think of TurboTax as a power player to that extent.
Yeah.
But it's wild because you're right. If we're going to get real nerdy with taxes. So when I started my career, I was, like many Americans, I was a 1099 contract employee, which means you have to figure out at the end, how much taxes do I owe?
That's
and
right.
Every year it was hanging over my head like a sword of Damocles. Like, how much do I owe? I don't want to defraud the government. And I know so many people who, their situation isn't even that complicated, but they live in this perpetual anxiety and spend 30 plus hours itemizing receipts. And it's, so you have H&R Block and all these tax preparation services, but are there other ways wealthy people are benefiting from the complexity of this system that are less obvious?
Yeah, because you can vary all sorts of giveaways in the tax code, um, that only apply to a small segment of people. For example, as I said, if you plant plantain, you get a tax break for doing that. Why the American needs more plantain? Is that the? I don't think that's the argument. The argument was their lobbyists came in and said, let's have a tax break for plantain growers. There are probably only 1,000 of them in the United States, and they got the break, and nobody knows it's in there. It's so obscure. It's like section 699-401-301Q. Nobody knows it's in there. There are hundreds of them. Every year, Congress adds about at least 100, sometimes 200 new tax breaks that we basically don't hear about it. They serve some particular group. So when people were developing electric cars, their lobbyists came in and said, gee, electric cars are a good thing, so let's give everybody $7,500 tax credit if they buy an electric car. Initially, it was just for American-made cars. And then the Japanese and the German manufacturers heard about it. They hired lobbyists and said, well, a Japanese electric car is just as good as one made in California, so let's give the break for that. And Congress did. So this is constantly going on. They're constantly adding these tax breaks. And once you do, each one of them costs the government money, and therefore, to raise the money government needs to pay for hospitals and highways and armies, they have to raise the taxes for everybody else because of these giveaways to certain groups.
Yeah, I was really shocked, but then the minute I thought about it for a while, it made perfect sense that of course complexity favors people with enormous economic privilege because again, like I said already, those are the people who can hire someone to figure it out or who can have a special interest advocate like move the pieces around.
Yeah.
And so I wondered if you could speak a little bit about this idea that was very new for me, this idea of a broad base low rate and how it shapes policy objectives with tax.
Yeah. So the abbreviation for this is BBLR. BBLR, and this is kind of the holy grail that all tax economists everywhere in the world agree on. A good tax code should be broad-based with low rates. That is, the tax base, the taxable income, the amount of income you pay tax on should be as broad as possible. You shouldn't get a break for your parking costs. You shouldn't get a break for your mortgage. You shouldn't get a break for paying for health insurance. All that should be included in your income. And if you do that, then you can raise the same amount of money at a lower tax rate. So instead of charging people in America, say 26% on tax, you could raise the same amount of income with a tax of 7%. Which people wouldn't have to dig through and find out how they paid the mortgage industry last year or how much they paid in taxes for gasoline. That would all be included in income, and then you'd pay tax at a much lower rate. And this does two things. First, it eliminates lots of mistakes because digging up the records and the numbers for all those exemptions and deductions leads to lots of errors. And second, you have to raise the rates in that case. When you have lower rates, people are more likely to pay. If your tax bill is 7%, you just fill in the form and send them the 7% and you're done. If the tax bill is 39%, well, you have a lot of interest in figuring every possible deduction or paying a lobbyist to get a deduction for you. So broaden the base so that all your income is taxable, and then you can lower the rates so that people are more likely to pay and there's less cheating. This is BBLR, and many countries have done it. The Netherlands did it, as I say in my book. New Zealand used to have a tax code like ours. The finance minister in New Zealand told me it was like Swiss cheese. So much income fell through the holes that they had to have very high rates to raise the money. And in New Zealand, they just eliminated all tax breaks. You got this money, it's taxable, and therefore they were able to cut the rates under 10% for just about everybody. Very few people in America pay less than 10%. So the Netherlands did it, Britain is doing it, New Zealand has done it. The US could do it too, except here's the problem. Every one of those thousands of tax breaks has a group of people who make or buy electric cars, people who plant plantain, people who recycle old tractors and get the tax break. If you put a lightning rod on your factory, you get a tax break for that. So the lightning rod industry supports that. Every one of them has lobbyists supporting it. And most people don't even know there's a tax break for lightning rods, so they're not fighting against it. And therefore, once you get a tax deduction or a tax exclusion in our code, it stays there forever. They just don't go away. And so that's the problem. If we could broaden the base, we could lower the rate sharply. You'd be paying not 26%, but 5% on income tax, and you'd just pay it. It would be much simpler and easier. There'd be less tax evasion, fewer mistakes. It really works. We just haven't been able to do it in the U.S.
I know it. Again, I'm going to keep holding this book up for our entire conversation. Everyone should read this because every other page you're going to be like, what? I didn't know that.
No. Why do we do that? Yeah.
You know? So I have so many questions and I only have you for so long. You speak glowingly about a few countries and the way they've done things. New Zealand is one of them. Estonia, France is apparently the king of soaking the rich, Yeah,
they're very good at soaking. That's right. They have a wealth tax. In addition to paying on your income, if the total amount of your earnings, of your ownership, that is your house, your second house, your third house, your airplane, your car, your bank account, and your stock portfolio, if that's more than $100 million, they take 2% of that too, in addition to your income tax. And I don't mind. I think that's okay. I mean, if we tax somebody with $100 million at 2%, well, that's $2 million for the government, and the guy still has $98 million. You can live okay at $98 million. I mean, gas is expensive, but you can still fill your Rolls Royce many times if you have $98 million in the bank. So
look, I think I could cut back and get to $98 million.
And,
yeah.
Several countries, about 11 countries have that kind of wealth tax. This is the tax, that Senator Elizabeth Warren ran for president on. And her tax kicks in at $50 million. That would hit maybe 120 American families at the most out of 330 million of us, and would raise pretty good money for the government, and it would still leave those people with $48 million in the bank after they paid the tax. What's wrong with that?
Well, and I was going to ask you, I mean, so a couple things, right? So you wrote this book in 2017, or it was published in 2017.
Yeah.
So what was it like for you to watch the whole Trump phenomenon with taxes? And do you feel hopeful about Biden's, bringing up things and ideas about a wealth tax?
Yeah, the kind of interesting thing is it partly by chance? We started the federal income tax in 1913, and originally it was incredibly simple. Only about 4% of American families paid it. It was only aimed at the rich. You had to be a Rockefeller or a Vanderbilt or an Astor to pay the tax. And the top rate was 7%. It was pretty small. And then gradually it grew and it grew and it grew. And every time they expanded the tax, they added a few deductions. And eventually it gets so complicated and such a mess that people throw up their hands and say this has to be fixed. They did that in 1954 under President Eisenhower and did a really big fix and threw away lots of deductions and exemptions and lowered the rates. And then for 32 years, they kept adding exemptions and deductions and raising the rates and making it more complicated. By 1986, it was a total mess, 32 years later, and a bipartisan reform took place under a Republican president, Ronald Reagan, and a Democratic Congress run by Democrat Tip O'Neill. They did the 1986 tax reform, which was really good. As I say in my book, it's the best we've ever done. They got rid of all sorts of exemptions and deductions and giveaways, and therefore they lowered rates. The top rate went from 70% to 28%, which, as I say, makes people more likely to pay. That was 1986, and guess what? Over the next 32 years, all sorts of exemptions and deductions and giveaways crept back in, at a rate of about 100 a year. And so by 2018, 32 years later, people realized it was time to fix the tax code. And so Donald Trump and the Republican Congress set out to do a major tax reform, as we've done every 30 years. And the initial plan for it was written by a Texas congressman, a Republican from Texas, Kevin Brady, was really good. I mean, it got rid of all sorts of giveaways, it lowered rates, it made things much simpler. And then the lobbyists came in. And by the time they finally passed that so-called tax reform bill in 2017, the rate still came down, but they didn't get rid of the giveaways. In fact, they added more of them. They made it more complicated. There are more pages of the tax code now than before their so-called reform. So that one didn't work. But for me, I'm still optimistic. Looking back at what happened in 1986, we could do this again. Republicans and Democrats could agree the thing is just too darn complicated. There's too many giveaways. There's too many forms and too many complicated lines in it. Let's just make it simpler and lower rates again. I think that could happen because I said we did it in 1986.
Well, because simplicity is a great equalizer. And I think that's what,
right.
Was really good for me. Like, I'm a progressive, and I obviously, like, of course I want people to get a write-off for electric cars. But it's really interesting, but it's really interesting, like your point, or at least tell me if I'm getting this wrong, is that, look, you just need to have it be very simple, because the more complicated you make it, that's going to hurt people who it's difficult to weasel out of things.
Yeah, well, and also every tax break for this group leads to another tax break for that group. So as we said, they decided to give a $7,500 credit if you buy an electric car, even if it's made in Germany or Japan. And guess what? The lobbyists for the hydrogen-fueled truck industry came in and said, oh, well, we need a tax break for hydrogen trucks too. So that's now in the tax code. I mean, there are very, very few people making or buying these trucks so far, but that's in there. And then when there's a water-propelled truck, that'll also get its own tax break, because each one kind of feeds the next. And that's why every few years we need to come through and just take a vacuum cleaner and wipe them all out. And then you have a much simpler tax code, fewer mistakes, and lower rates. You broaden the base, you lower the rates. BBLR, as you say, that's what all tax economists agree is the answer for a good tax code.
Because it's like you're saying, and again, I would have never thought of this, but it doesn't matter what the tax rates are if people aren't paying them. Like, we want.
Yeah, and the higher they are, the fewer people pay. The more impetus people have to hire a lawyer or an accountant and find a way not to pay.
Well, and so, okay. So, one thing you talk about in terms of simplicity is like the flat tax and how that actually doesn't work. I know that's a Republican thing. They love the idea of a flat tax.
Yeah.
And you write like that. No, that's simplicity in a bad way.
Yeah. So the idea is, rather than have graduated rates, currently the rate of income tax ranges from 10% up to 36.5%, depending on your income in the United States. So that's so complicated. Why don't we just have everybody pay 16%? And the argument is, well, that's fair. I pay 16%, and Steve Bezos, who's worth $100 billion, pays 16%. As a matter of fact, it doesn't work. As you say, many politicians, including some Democrats, but mostly Republicans, have argued for a flat tax in the United States. It's a huge boon to the rich. The guy who pointed this out, incidentally, is a billionaire named Donald Trump, who wrote in his book, he'd love a flat tax because it would save him hugely. He'd pay much less tax, but his chauffeur and his gardener would have to pay more tax to make up for what he was not paying. But what happened was, after the Soviet Union fell apart in the 1990s, about 12 of these newly formed countries in Eastern Europe all tried the flat tax. Everybody paid 18% or everybody paid 19%. And as I point out in my book, it didn't work. It didn't work. And the reason is it's hard to bring in enough money for the government, all the money the government needs at a rate of 16 or 17%, and therefore they raise them. It goes to 19% and then 21%. In Hungary today, the tax is 27%. And this is what you have to do to have a flat tax. And so it just, you get to a point where working class people on an average wage just can't afford to pay that tax anymore. So you need the graduated rates, the higher rates for rich people to reduce the burden on low income people and still produce enough money for government. So it was an interesting idea. Like every other idea about tax, it was tried in some country. That's what I say in my book. You have an idea about tax policy, some country tried it, I guarantee you. And that's why I did this book. I went around the world to see how these ideas worked, and it turns out the flat tax is a bust. It just doesn't work.
Well, and so, your book opens with talking about the 1913 income tax as a way to keep in check the Gilded Age monopolies that were forming.
Yeah.
And that blew my mind because
That's what it was for.
because now it's the opposite. The income tax is something that middle class families pay, and one percenters don't pay for their capital gains. How did that transition happen?
Well, that came about because the rich people who were paying could afford to pay lobbyists. And in the United States, our Supreme Court has said that spending money to influence an election is free speech. It's protected by the First Amendment. Other countries don't say that. Other countries say you can talk or write anything you want, but spending money is not protected by free speech. But in the United States, it is. And therefore, rich people can afford to pay the lobbyists to get things done. I say in my book that, the pharmaceutical industry, which develops our modern miracle drugs, cures diseases, saves lives, they make big investments on drug research. That's no question, they do. But I said in my book, one of the best investments they ever made was buying Congress. Was giving donations to congressmen so they get big tax breaks and big tax benefits. And I addressed the American Pharmaceutical Association, and they were really ticked off at me for saying that they invested in congressmen. But they do, and that's how these giveaways get in there. If you have a lot of money, you'd rather pay a lobbyist to save you some of that money than pay it to the government in taxes. That's how those things get in there. And as I say, once they're in, they tend to stay. I mean, how many people know that there's a tax deduction for recycling an old tractor? Nobody knows it, so nobody fights against it. It's going to be there forever.
Ugh.
Yeah.
Well, so how did this go? Because I felt this way with the Healing of America too. I'm like, how is he doing this? So were you just like going to each country and like living for a little bit and then finding the French version of H&R Block? And like, how did this process go? Because the result is very cool.
Yeah, that's what I did. I go to other countries and I generally hire a reporter to help me. I interview people for the tax book. I interviewed tax commissioners, finance ministers, economists, ordinary old taxpayers. Did I go to H&R Block in France? No, I did not. And here's why. Guess what? Other countries don't have H&R Block. The tax is
I sort of saw that coming.
straightforward and simple there. You can walk down the street and you can't find an H&R Block. There are accountants who do taxes for corporations. But for you and me, no, they don't need H&R Block in those countries. They either fill out the form themselves, or as they say, the government fills it out for them, and you just make sure it's right and check the box. I was in the Netherlands. I have a really good friend, Michael Sveers, lives in Amsterdam. He's pretty wealthy. He makes probably about $250,000 a year in dollars in our money. His wife makes another $100,000. He has a beautiful home. He has an apartment on the ocean. Lots of investments. Owns a lot of stocks. in America, his tax return, he'd have to fill out about 24 different forms. And I happened to be in his apartment, actually in his beautiful home in Amsterdam on March 31st. April 1st is their tax day. And I said, Michael, have you done your taxes yet? And he said, oh, no, I got to do that. I got to do that. Just a minute, he said. So it takes him about 8 minutes to do his federal and local income tax. And what he does is he goes online. The government has filled out the form for him, right? And if the numbers look about right, he checks okay, and he's paid his taxes. It's done. And then he says to me, he's kind of a Republican, he doesn't trust government, right? So he says, I really don't trust government to get it right. He says, some years I have to check the numbers that they've filled in on the form. He says, damn it. He says, it's really a pain. He says, you start checking those numbers, it can take almost half an hour just to pay your damn taxes. That was his complaint. So,
I wish I had that problem, dude. Okay.
Yeah, I'll take that problem in a minute. Exactly. So that's where, I was going to go to H&R Block in every country. And they're not there. They don't need them. You don't need them if the system is simple, or if the government fills out your form for you.
Okay. So first of all, I know I only have you for a few more minutes, so I want to be respectful of your time, but I have to know, what was your favorite country? Like, you list quite a few in here that do things better than us, but what was your, would you see as the ideal for America?
Well, I do believe I'm an optimist about American politics. I think eventually we do the right thing eventually. And therefore, I was really impressed with New Zealand, because New Zealand's tax system, as I said, was a complicated mess with lots and lots of giveaways. The Swiss cheese system, as I said, the finance minister said, and they got fed up with it. They said, the hell with this. We're sick of paying high rates. We're sick of these complicated forms. And they got rid of all deductions and exemptions, and made everything taxable, and sharply cut the rates. So as I said, almost everybody there pays under 10%. It's easy. You get it done in about 20 minutes one night in the spring. It doesn't cost much because the rates are low. And they had a system just like ours, except they don't have as much lobbying as we do. So I like the fact that they made that change. In Japan, I lived in Japan, and I paid really high taxes. I was kind of stunned at how high the taxes were in Japan, but it sure was simple to pay. They fill out the form for you. And I used to go down to the bank and pay my tax bill in cash. It's sort of how they do it there. So I think that was good too, that they made it so simple. And then in the UK and Great Britain, they've also made the system so simple. The government does the taxes for you. So I like those systems. I like places where, as I said, BBLR, where they broaden the base and therefore reduce the complexity and lower the rates. And there are several countries that have done it. There's now a BBLR movement internationally sweeping through Europe. Other countries are going to do what the UK and Netherlands have done. And it makes me hopeful. We could do it too. Doggone it. When we get sick and tired of April 15th or April 18th this year, filling out all those damn forms and getting confused and figuring 18.63% of line 17 unless line 42 is greater than 18. When we get sick of that stuff, I think we will fix it, because Americans tend to do the right thing eventually.
Well, first we have to duel H&R Block, which I didn't know this was my main adversary in life, but let me tell you, okay? Last week I spent 3 days with an Excel spreadsheet being like, okay, how much did I spend on business travel? And everyone does that. Everyone. And it's ridiculous.
Yeah. And H&R Block profits from it, so they fight to keep the current system. They want it to be difficult. Then we have to use them.
Well, and another one of your excellent books, which I'm annoyed I didn't think to have it on hand, but The Healing of America. So very similar thing. You traveled all around the world. When you were so you've done both of these incredible charismatic projects which show people, okay, like, hey, a lot of the problems we have here have been solved in other wealthy democracies. Maybe we should take our cues there. Did you see a connection between the tax stuff and the healthcare stuff?
Yeah, I saw where governments looked at a problem and thought about it intelligently and said we could do this better. That happened both with tax and with healthcare. And the other interesting thing is, most people in the United States, in the world, around the world, look up to the United States. We are the freest, the richest, the strongest, most innovative country. Everybody is using our software. Everybody is watching our movies and TV. Everybody is listening to Taylor Swift and Kanye. People really look up to and admire the United States, but then they're confused why we've botched it on things like healthcare and taxes. When I was doing my healthcare book, I went to other rich countries, advanced democracies like us, which all of them provide healthcare for everybody. And I said to the health minister, I said to economists, the prime minister in these countries, I said, why do you provide healthcare for everybody? And the most common answer I got was, why don't you? The U.S. is so rich and such a generous country. Why do you leave 31 million people with no health insurance? It's a good question. Why do we? And I'm pretty sure that eventually we will provide health care for everybody. But you know what? Jocelyn, there's a common problem with tax, and that is in our current healthcare system, which is the most expensive in the world. It leaves 30 million people out of it. We have much worse health outcomes than Western European countries, but there are certain big winners. The insurance companies, the pharmaceutical companies, and the for-profit hospital industry, they're doing fabulously in our current system, and therefore they fight change. They don't want to see everybody have health insurance because they're doing great in the current system, and that makes it hard to change. I think eventually we will do the right thing and provide health care for everybody in our country who needs it. I mean, doggone it, if one of my neighbors is sick or injured, I want to get her to a doctor and get her better. It just seems like a moral obligation to do that. So I think we will, and I think eventually we'll get our tax code in a more sensible direction, as we did in 1986, and then we let it go to pot again.
It's so funny because as you're talking, it feels like there's a parallel between this complexity in the healthcare system and complexity in the tax system. It's like when things are really complicated, ordinary people frequently end up forking over their money, not because they're dumb or uninformed, but because it's so complicated.
The system has been rigged. The system has been rigged against ordinary people by the people who benefit from the existing system. That's true in both. I did another comparative policy book on crime, why it is that the U.S. has more murders than any country in the world except Yemen. Yemen has more murders per capita than we do. Why other countries have vastly lower rates of burglary and rape and murder. When I was living in Japan, there was one of these terrible stories. There were two Japanese graduate students in Los Angeles, and they were driving down the street in Los Angeles, and a guy came up to them with a gun and shot them and stole the car. And this was huge news in Japan, And a guy from the Yomiuri Shimbun, a big Japanese newspaper, called me up. He was just totally confused by this. What happened? What happened? And I said, well, it's a carjack. You know what a carjack is. A guy comes up to you with a gun and steals your car. And this guy says, that happens? That happens? There's never been a carjack in the entire history of Japan. They just don't have it. It's not thinkable. So why do we have it and other countries don't? I wrote a book about that too. It's called Confucius Lives Next Door. That also would make great Mother's Day giving for your mom. She'd love to read that book.
I actually would love to read that book. I'm embarrassed I haven't.
Yeah, take a look at it. Why?
You don't think less of me, do you? Because that sounds like an amazing book.
Yeah, that's a very interesting book. And that also, unlike most of my books, that book has sold really well. It's still in print. You can find it. It'll be in your library if you want. Um, but the fact is, we don't have to have these high crime rates. The other countries with much lower rates of violent crime have fewer police, fewer judges, and fewer jails than we do, and yet they have safer communities. We could too.
And I hate to ask you the same question twice, but did you, again, so when did you do that book?
I did that book. I think that book came out in 2001, maybe 2004, around that time. I had lived in East Asia, and when we lived in Tokyo, it's a city of 32 million people. We could send our 7-year-old down the street at 8 o'clock at night to get a quart of milk, and she'd come back safe. We knew that. I mean, it was just a safe place. I grew up in Michigan, and while I was living in Tokyo, my 87-year-old mother went to a shopping mall, and she was mugged in the parking lot, right? And I was talking to her on the phone. I said, "Oh, Mom, this is terrible. This is terrible." And she said, "Well, it happens. These things happen." No, it doesn't happen in Japan. They don't mug 87-year-old women in the parking lot in Japan or in the Netherlands or in Sweden. It doesn't happen. So it doesn't have to happen here either if we would learn something from other countries. And we've learned a lot of stuff from other countries, a lot of everyday aspects of American life we learned from other countries. Cell phones, came from other countries. Text messages were invented in Finland. American Idol is a copy of a British TV show. Pizza, sushi, yoga. We've drawn a lot of good ideas from other countries. So why don't we take some of these policy ideas to make our streets safer, makes our taxes easier, and make our health care better? We could do that.
Well, I hate to end on a personal note, but I'm just very curious. So what, other than a hatred of authority, which, I think that's a good quality to have, by the way. What is it like, where did you get this whole inspiration to do this comparative analysis of so many policy issues?
When I became a foreign correspondent, and when you're living in other countries, rich or poor, but I was living mainly in rich, democratic, capitalist countries like ours, you just see things that are better. For example, in Australia and New Zealand, if you want to mail a letter, there are two mailboxes. One is the government post office, and one is a private post office. One is red and one is green. That's how you know. And they compete, and that keeps postal rates down. We could do that. We could have. In fact, it's illegal in the United States for any private carrier to carry a first-class letter. But I wrote about that. We could do that. We could make that work. So there are many different ideas. In Japan, Japan is an aging society. You go to the street corner and it says push for a walk signal. Well, in Japan, it's such an aging society, they have a second button that says push for longer. If you're a slow walker, you get a longer walk signal. Pretty simple to do. Many American communities could use that. There's just a lot of simple ideas like that would work in the U.S., and that's what I started to notice. And then when we lived in Western Europe, same thing. They have a lot of good ideas that work, and why don't we do it too?
Well, and it sounds like you're connecting the influence money has on our politicians with a lot of these common sense reforms. It sounds like that just doesn't exist as much in other places.
Yes, that's right. When I lived in Britain, I was there for two or three elections for the House of Parliament, for the House of Commons, for the Parliament, their Congress, and they had a spending limit. The total amount you could spend on a race for a seat in Parliament was $39,000. And in America, a guy spends that in the first hour of a campaign for Congress. You couldn't run for dog catcher in America for $39,000 because we have so much money in our politics. And when I was in Britain, some woman went over. She spent about $48,000, and they kicked her out of Congress for doing that. We could have limits like that too, so that people ran on something other than how many ads they could put on TV. There are changes we could make that would improve our society. On the other hand, other countries learn from us. I mean, all over the world, there are people walking around who would be dead today if it weren't for some American medical innovation.
Yeah.
So, in the same way, they learn from us. They watch our TV and movies. They read our books. They listen to our music. They do our dances. And we could learn from them. That's the argument of my books.
I have loved this so much. I've been so excited about this conversation for a while now. And I've learned even more talking to you. What should people do? Go out, buy this book, buy Helium America. And what's the name of the crime book again?
Confucius Lives Next Door.
Okay.
Yeah,
do you want
read
to
the
come
book,
back and
and
talk
if
about that one sometime?
something in there strikes you as a good idea, tell your legislator, tell your member of Congress, why don't we do this? Members of Congress listen. If somebody says to them, gee, I understand in Japan and Britain, the government fills out your tax return for you, so it only takes 5 minutes to file. Why don't we do that? You know, if Congress heard that from enough people, they could do it.
I think a lot of people just don't know that. I mean, I certainly didn't.
No, people don't know that there are, and you know, in many ways, we are number one. You know, we are the best in the world in many areas of human endeavor. So people don't really realize that other countries are doing better than we are at providing health care to their population, or taxing their population, or making communities safe. But they are doing that, and we could learn from them.
Well, thank you so much, TR, for being on here. And again, you're gonna have to come back and discuss Confucius Next Door. So be ready for that.
Story. That's a good book. Yeah, thanks. Florence, thanks so much for having me on your air, and everybody get your taxes done.
Yeah, absolutely. And try not to take 30 hours.
Oh, God, that's the average. Yeah.
Okay, don't take more than 30 hours. 30 hours upper limit. Thank
Okay.
you so much.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thanks.